The slave trade was first introduced to America in 1619. Slaves worked on southern tobacco plantations, but the economy did not fully depend on them. However, Eli Whitney's invention of the cotton gin in 1793 brought about a huge demand for slave labor. The cotton gin allowed for the wide-scale cultivation of cotton, which quickly became the dominant part of the southern economy. Over time, the nation's economy began to depend heavily upon the cotton industry. The South produced an abundance of cotton, which was sent to New England. Northern shippers would sell the cotton in England and use the money to buy needed manufactured goods to sell in the U.S. By 1840, cotton accounted for half the value of American exports and provided much of the money that prompted America's economic growth. The South produced over half of the world's supply of cotton. Britain's most important manufacture in the 1850s was cotton cloth, causing it to depend heavily on the South, which produced about 75% of Britain's cotton. The Southern plantation owners were aware that many countries depended on their cotton, which provided them with a sense of power. They saw cotton as the king, the cotton gin as the throne, and the slaves as the henchmen. The large cultivation of cotton created an insecure dependence on a one-crop economy. If the cotton crop failed 1 year, the entire American economy would be brought down. Eventually, the abundant growth of cotton paid its toll on the earth. Money-hungry farmers cultivated more and more cotton, despoiling the earth. The economy of the South became progressively more monopolistic. As the amount of good land dwindled, small farmers sold their property to large plantation owners and moved north or west. The gap between the rich and the poor grew bigger. Slaves provided most, if not all, of the labor in the fields. They were not inexpensive to keep, however. Plantation owners, after paying for the slaves themselves, also had to pay for their bondage. The slaves were not given much, only 1 set of clothing per year and 8 pounds of either pork or fish, or a bushel of cornmeal per month. However, considering the number of slaves large plantation owners had, it still added up to a considerable amount. Southern planters hated seeing the North profit at their expense. They disliked the commissions and interests to northern middlemen, bankers, agents, and shippers, when the South was the one producing the cotton. By the 1850s, Southerners despised the fact that they spent their lives in servitude to northern manufacturing.
Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land.
The slave system socially harmed both the African American slaves and the slave owners. Slaves were treated as mere objects of property, and in the South, a slave owner's social standing depended on the number of slaves he owned. The families who owned more than 100 slaves each formed an oligarchy and led the South in making the major political and social decisions. This widened the gap between the rich and poor, making social mobility more difficult. Slavery also led to the beginning of racism in America. Slave owners admitted that they liked African Americans as individuals, but despised the race as a whole. Freed African Americans faced racism as well. They were declined the opportunities of working in certain occupations, testifying against Caucasians in court, holding the right to vote, and receiving an education from public schools. Most significantly, slavery created difficult lives for the slaves. They were mostly treated like investments or property instead of people. African American women who gave birth to more than 10 babies, all of which would grow up to be valuable slaves, were promised their freedom. When a slave grew too old and no longer held much use, he or she was left to die. The slave is a human being, divested of all rights. In law, a slave has no wife, no children, no country, and no home. In auctions, they were seen and sold with cattle and horses. Families were often torn apart as a result of bankruptcy or division of property among heirs. Frederick Douglass recalled that I never saw my mother more than 4 or 5 times in my life, and each of these times was very short in duration, and at night. Slaves were punished through whippings to enforce their obedience to their masters. The lives of slaves were so difficult that some believed death was a better alternative than the heavy chains of human bondage. A slave girl was asked if her mother was dead and responded, "Yes, sir, master, she is dead, but she's free." Although rebellious slaves were punished, they were never whipped so hard as to handicap them, as they would be needed in the field the next day. Slavery also harmed the slave owners psychologically. They grew to imagine that they were surrounded by rebellious slaves who could only be quieted down by the whip or by the branding iron. Slave owning also thwarted the progress of the South, because by the mid-19th century it was the last place that still practiced slavery. All other nations in the world had already moved on. As James L. Bradley declared, "I used to think a great deal about freedom. It was my heart's desire. I could not keep it out of my mind. Many a sleepless night I've spent in tears because I was a slave. I looked back on all I had suffered, and when I looked ahead, all was dark and hopeless bondage. My heart ached to feel within me the life of liberty." However, slavery did give America a new rich culture with both aspects of African and American customs. The merging of African and Western music led to the development of jazz. Slaves also used their African roots in their religious practices by emphasizing the elements of Christianity which describe their situation, such as the captivity of the Israelites in Egypt. Some of their most powerful spiritual ideas were created then. African customs also created the responsorial style of preaching, which still persists.
Abolitionism had already begun during the Revolution, especially with the Quakers. The first efforts to get rid of slavery, though, were focused on shipping the African Americans back to Africa. In 1817, the American Colonization Society was founded to transport slaves back to Africa. Later, in 1822, the Republic of Liberia was established to give the former slaves a place to live. However, many of them did not want to be taken back to Africa. By 1860, almost all of Southern slaves were native-born African Americans and had developed their own history and culture. They did not wish to be taken to a strange. The abolitionist movement really took off in the 1830s. The Second Great Awakening spurred many abolitionists to take action against the sin of slavery. Theodore Dwight Weld was prominent among them and preached against slavery, even writing a pamphlet called American Slavery as It Is. On New Year's Day in 1831, William Lloyd Garrison published the first edition of his anti-slavery newspaper, The Liberator, which triggered a 30-year war with words and, in a sense, fired one of the first shots of the Civil War. In 1833, other dedicated abolitionists founded the American Anti-Slavery Society as well. African American abolitionists were living monuments to the cause. David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world advocated an end to white supremacy, and Sojourner Truth fought endlessly for emancipation and women's rights. Frederick Douglass was perhaps the greatest of all the black abolitionists. His autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, discussed his origins and struggles and escape to freedom in 1838. In the end, most abolitionists supported war as a cost for emancipation. Reporters noted how freed slaves in the North were persecuted and harassed, while in the South slaves were still treated well, given food, and cared for. These pro-slavery arguments only made the separation between the South and the North side worse. Freedom of speech became endangered when Congress passed the Gag Resolution in 1836. This resolution ordered all anti-slavery appeals to be tabled without debate, attacking the right of petition and arousing the anger of Northerners like John Quincy Adams. Abolitionists and their efforts were assaulted with jailings, whippings, and lynching as a result. Because many people had been brought to believe in the values of the slavery compromises in the Constitution, abolitionists were extremely unpopular for a long time in some parts of the North. Furthermore, the South owed the North around $300 million by the late 1850s. New England textile mills needed cotton from the South, and therefore, if the labor system was destroyed, the supply of cotton would be cut off and would result in unemployment. By the 1850s, however, the abolitionist outcry began to make an impact on the Northern mind. Many began to see the South as a place of the unfree and of a hateful institution. Few were ready to abolish slavery immediately, but as time went on, more and more people began to support the abolitionist cause.
The issue over slavery eventually tore the nation apart and changed American society, especially that of the South, for years to come.
Coming for to care.